Hey there. Wanted to chime in from vacation and talk about the horror show that is unfolding in Iraq right now. I'd like to preface this by saying this is not really going to be a video about the Iraqi people, which is unfortunate because, of course, it's the Iraqi people who are going to suffer the most from this new set of idiotic developments, but this video is going to be more about the relationship between the United States and Iran. I haven't done the necessary research to get up to speed on the extraordinarily important and complicated things that are happening in Iraq right now and to Iraqi politics. Instead, this unproduced video is just going to focus on the US versus Iran, which is unfortunately something that's going to be having Iraq sort of take a back seat for some time to come. It's becoming, it's not yet absolutely certain, but it's becoming more and more likely that this is going to be the story of Iraq this year, and it's a real shame. So here we go. It's deeply sad, but also kind of darkly comic what's going on in Iraq right now. If you step back a bit, to some extent, one of the main factors of U.S. policy, one of the most important things in the minds of U.S. policymakers, is an event that happened about 40 years ago. It was the invasion and occupation of a U.S. embassy in Tehran, in Iran, and the abduction of some diplomats who worked there. So for 40 years, we've been whining about it. We've been complaining about this is the fact that this is something that has happened. We've borne a grudge against Iran, and a lot of the actions that the U.S. government has taken and all that time since have been about that. Well, on Tuesday, all of this just endless time and money and death has led to yet another embassy occupation. It's over now. Nobody was abducted. It was not as serious as what happened in Tehran 40 years ago, but it was made very obvious that something like that is very possible, and it was an incredibly humiliating thing for the United States to go through, but richly deserved because it's depressing to talk about, but it's also kind of funny in a really sad way. All we do is whine about the Iran hostages from 40 years ago, and we've got the exact same situation quite possibly developing in Baghdad. That was meant to be kind of funny, but I don't find it funny. It's just sad. And what this is about the same thing it's been about for 40 fucking years, which is this symbiotic relationship between Iranian hardliners and U.S. hardliners. It's very important to certain people in U.S. politics and to certain people in Iranian politics to look like a badass and talk about how tough they are against the other country, which is deeply annoying when you think about it, because really, like, the strongest ally that an Iranian hardliner has is a U.S. hardliner. Like Tom Cotton and the Supreme Leader, I mean, they should send each other Christmas cards because they are the best servant of each other. There are a lot of people in Iranian politics who owe their position and continued power to talking about the threat from the United States. There are a lot of people in U.S. politics who owe their position and their continued power to talking about the threat from Iran. It's this tremendous circle of idiocy, and they just get richer and profit more. The rest of the world bears the risks, and over the past 20 years, it's been the Iraqi and Syrian people that have died in their hundreds of thousands because of this just fucking idiotic relationship that they have. And now it looks like it's spooling up again, and spooling up in possibly a more serious way than it has in years, possibly if ever. In Iraq, the embassy invasion on Tuesday was sort of part 3 in a tit for tat. A U.S. mercenary, I believe, died a week ago Friday. In response, the U.S. killed 25 people from this anti-ISIS militia that supposedly killed that mercenary. And then we had the invasion of the embassy. As I look at the news right now. More things are quite possibly developing in Baghdad this evening. It's just a goddamn mess. The saddest thing about the way things that are developing right now is I think that this was the second opportunity. This was over this whole 40-year period, there have been two opportunities to finish this, to sort of finally quash this ridiculous conflict, this ridiculous self-sustaining relationship between U.S. hardliners and Iranian hardliners that does nothing for the world other than cause destruction. So we had the second opportunity. The first opportunity was a man named Saddam Hussein. What's interesting about these opportunities is that both of these opportunities were created by the United States, not because they actually wanted to bring peace, but because we, my government, created monsters that were meant to fight Iran that ended up being vastly worse than Iran. The first of these was Saddam Hussein. And it makes sense that it would be the United States that would be creating these monsters because we are vastly more powerful than Iran is. That's sort of the fundamental silliness of this relationship. The fact that Iran and the United States are supposed to be competitors, they're not. Iran is a small, poor, not a small country, it's a mid-sized, poor country. The United States is the most powerful country the world has ever seen. But we don't really want the hassle of invading and destroying Iran, so we create a series of monsters to fight them. The first of these was Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was nominally, at the beginning of his career in the 70s, nominally more aligned with the Soviets, but after 1979 and the birth of the Islamic Republic of Iran, he found a much more profitable line of work or geopolitical alignment in being the enemy of Iran. He invaded Iraq in the early 1980s. It was a full decade of really horrific war. Throughout it, the U.S. was careful not to directly fund too many of his weapons, but our allies, the Gulf states, poured billions of dollars into turning Saddam Hussein into the heavily armed, he was always a madman, but to turn him into the heavily armed threat that he was. So that was an opportunity because Saddam Hussein, through his invasion of Kuwait, became the bad guy, became someone who for a period of time looked more threatening than Iran. And even after the first Gulf War, he was there as that threat that could bring Iran and the United States together to deal with that threat. There were efforts made. It looked possible. After 9/11, the Iranian government reached out to the United States and did everything it could to try to help against the Sunni jihadists that had done 9/11. And of course, Iran would have always have been open to being helpful against Saddam Hussein. But that wasn't something that the Bush administration was interested in. So that opportunity was squandered. Ridiculously, in the Axis of Evil speech, George W. Bush combined Iran and Iraq as enemies of the United States, even though Iran and Iraq hated each other to the core of their being. So instead, the United States decided to hold on to Iran as an enemy and destroy Saddam Hussein, very predictably giving a lot more power to Iran, because Iraq is a majority Shia country, and that is the Shia religion is sort of what motivates and underpins the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is just all so depressing. So Saddam Hussein was the first opportunity for peace between Iran and the United States, and it was squandered. For the 10 years after the invasion of Iraq, Iran was once again sort of public enemy number one, and we started talking about all the terrorism they were doing, even though the terrorism that the U.S. public and most human beings actually cared about was being carried out by Saudi Arabia, not their main enemy, Iran. So Iran became the focus again. But in 2014, there was yet another opportunity for the United States and Iran to reach some kind of peace agreement, some kind of some kind of arrangement. And that, once again, was provided by a monster that the United States created. I'm speaking, of course, about ISIS or Daesh or the Islamic State, as they decided to call themselves in 2014. That is the entity that the entity was created earlier, of course, by the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But the reason it was able to become that powerful was because the United States tried so hard to destroy an Iranian ally in Syria. The Obama administration's efforts to overthrow Assad created a vast empty space for the jihadists of ISIS to create the Islamic State and to create a truly terrifying, horrifying monstrosity. ISIS was dedicated just as much to the destruction of the United States and the destruction of the Shia sect of Islam. They were a monstrous enemy, the perfect evil that Iran and the United States could band together to fight. And the crazy thing is, this isn't something that's reported very much or talked about much, is that they absolutely did. Obviously, there wasn't anything at the top level, but there was a lot of cooperation in Iraq specifically. Because after a decade of tragedy and horror, Iran and the United States realized that they had a common interest in a somewhat stable Iraq. An Iraq that was stable enough to continue to produce oil, that was stable enough to not constantly remind the world of the horrific crime of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. An Iraq that was stable enough for Iran to do business with the country that was right next door to them. So Iran and the United States had this interest in a stable Iraq, and they had this horrifying enemy that they had to fight and destroy. And for about 3 years, that's what happened. Again, not in any real open and obvious way, but that's what was going on. I think that's a really important sort of context to the Iran nuclear deal that was signed in 2015. It's an interesting question whether or not that could have happened if the U.S. and Iranian military forces weren't at that time working together against the Islamic State. It's something that's almost never tied together mostly because I think a lot of people in the United States and Iran were embarrassed that this cooperation was happening. So that was the opportunity, this idea that, like, God, obviously we hate each other, but let's stop using Iraq as this battleground, because of course it's the fact that the U.S. and Iran were using Iraq as a battleground that also contributed to the rise of the Islamic State. So for a while, really from 2014 to, and disintegrating, obviously, after Trump decided to throw out the Iran nuclear deal, but really from 2014 up until really the past week or so, there was a kind of peace that was sort of left between Iran and the United States. An uneasy, very uneasy peace between Iran and the United States in Iraq. And it's really this week, over the past week or so, that it started falling apart. And yeah, this is the second great opportunity for peace between the United States and Iran that was the Islamic State. That's over now, and it's been fully discarded. Apparently, the Secretary of Defense was actually on Fox News over the past, it was today or the day before, talking about how we're really going to get serious about countering Iran in Iraq again, which is not a mission that is legal, not a mission that the U.S. public wants. It's just something that's happening. I've made a video about what this is likely to look like. I'll link that at the end of this. It's not good, folks. It's not good. Of course, the video that's linked at the end, that's the absolute, horror show. That's like what happens if we just, if this crap just keeps steamrolling and nobody in the United States is able to stop it and nobody in Iran is able to stop it. But man, it's looking a lot more possible. So that's like the horror scenario, but it's looking a lot more possible today than it did even 2 weeks ago. We've got apparently it's stuff that we don't even know about concretely yet. Stuff happening this evening. By the time you're watching this tomorrow morning, you'll know more about what happened. There's something that happened at Baghdad airport. Possibly the U.S. assassinated a high-level anti-ISIS militia fighter in Iraq. Who knows? It looks bad. Trump is sending more troops. That's also bad. So we could already be in this sort of cycle of escalation that leads to the next $1 trillion war. That would be an incredible waste of U.S. treasure, resources, lives, but much more importantly, another decade or half decade or even just a year of horror for the long-suffering people of Iraq. Yeah, this is sort of a depressing one. And the neighbor's music, I'm in Puerto Rico now, the neighbor's music is beginning to drown me out, so I think I'll just leave it on that depressing note. Yeah, there was a real opportunity here for peace between the United States and Iran finally, and it's been strangled. It's been strangled in its crib. Donald Trump is absolutely the most responsible person for this, but let's be honest. Donald Trump wouldn't have been able to create this disaster if it weren't for a massive foreign policy establishment that just wanted to keep this fight going because they make money off of it. It's a tremendous opportunity just sort of pissed away. It's a sad thing. Anyway, sorry I couldn't be more optimistic, but it's just not good news. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. What am I pitching now? Yeah.